The wind was a restless spirit on the high plains, a lonely voice that whispered secrets to the dust and the stone. It clawed at the weathered timbers of Jedediah's cabin, a constant reminder of the isolation he had carved for himself out of the heart of a merciless land. He stood on his porch, a silhouette against the bruised twilight, his hand resting on the worn grip of the Colt at his hip. The last rays of sunlight bled across the horizon, painting the jagged peaks in hues of blood and gold, a beautiful, brutal canvas that mirrored the landscape of his own soul. He had come here to bury the man he had been, the gunslinger whose name was once spoken in hushed, fearful tones from dusty saloons to bustling cattle towns. He had traded the roar of gunfire for the sigh of the wind, the company of men for the silent judgment of the mountains. But peace was a phantom, a ghost that danced just beyond his reach, and the silence of the wilderness often echoed with the screams he had tried to leave behind. Have you ever felt a loneliness so profound it becomes a physical weight, a pressure against your chest that makes each breath a conscious effort? This is the story of a man who believed his heart was as barren as the dust bowl around him, and the woman who would prove that even in the most desolate soil, something beautiful and resilient can take root. This is the story of a love that was never meant to be, a love that would defy a nation and unite two worlds. It began, as so many things in the West did, with the whisper of death and the hard, unyielding reality of the dust. He saw her first as a crumpled heap of buckskin and shadow, a place where the earth seemed to have broken and offered up a human form. He drew his gun, his instincts screaming danger, his eyes scanning the endless expanse for the threat that must surely be lurking nearby. But there was only the wind and the silence. Cautiously, he approached, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt. She was a girl, barely a woman, with hair as black as a raven's wing splayed against the pale, thirsty ground. Her face, etched with the fine lines of her people, was a mask of pain, her breathing shallow and ragged. An arrow, fletched with the markings of an Apache warrior, was broken off in her shoulder, the wound a dark, angry flower blooming on her skin. Her lips were cracked and bloodless. She was dying. Jedediah had seen enough death to recognize its patient, deliberate work. His first instinct, the cold, hard voice of survival that had kept him alive for so long, told him to turn away. She was not his to save. She was Apache, and in this part of the country, that name was a death sentence for any white man who got too close. But then her eyes fluttered open, dark pools of terror and defiance. In them, he did not see an enemy. He saw a soul caught in the same brutal trap as his own, a fellow creature pinned beneath the indifferent boot heel of a cruel world. He holstered his pistol, the click of the hammer echoing the sudden, decisive shift in his own heart. He knelt, his shadow falling over her, and with a gentleness that would have shocked any man who knew his reputation, he gathered her into his arms. She was light, fragile as a broken bird, and as he lifted her from the dust, a single, pained sigh escaped her lips before she surrendered to the darkness. He carried her toward the flickering lamplight of his cabin, a sanctuary he had built to keep the world out, never imagining he would one day carry the heart of it inside. The wind howled, as if in protest or perhaps in warning. But for the first time in years, Jedediah didn't feel so alone in its mournful cry. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of those he couldn't save, and now, fate had laid another soul at his door, daring him to try one more time. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of pine wood and old regrets. Lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the small space into a haven of gold and black. Jedediah laid her gently on his own cot, the rough-spun blanket a stark contrast to her buckskin dress. For a long moment, he simply stood over her, a man adrift in a sea of impossible choices. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to leave her be, to ride away and never look back. Helping her was not just a risk. It was a declaration of war against the unspoken laws of the frontier. But the sight of her, so utterly helpless, stirred the embers of the man he once was, the man before the war, before the killing, before his heart had been turned to stone. He saw not an Apache, but a child of God, bleeding out on his floor. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire past, he set to work. He stoked the fire, its hungry flames licking at the kindling, and set a pot of water to boil. His hands, usually so steady with a gun, trembled slightly as he gathered clean rags and the small box of medical supplies he kept for his own frequent injuries. He was no doctor, but he knew wounds. He knew the clean, sharp bite of a bullet and the jagged tear of a blade. The arrow was another matter. The shaft had been snapped off, leaving the head buried deep in her shoulder. He knew that to save her, he would have to cause her more pain than she was already in. He hardened his heart, falling back on the grim determination of a field surgeon. He took a long swallow of whiskey from the bottle on his table, the fiery liquid doing little to steady his nerves, then poured some onto a rag. He gently, carefully, cut away the sleeve of her dress, exposing the mangled flesh. The arrowhead was barbed, a cruel design meant to tear and hold. As he cleaned the area, her body twitched, and a low moan escaped her lips. Her eyes opened again, wide with panic, and she tried to scramble away, her good hand pushing weakly against his chest. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough and used to softness. "Easy, girl. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm trying to help." She didn't understand his words, but she understood the gentleness in his touch, the earnest plea in his eyes. Her struggle ceased, but the fear remained, a wild, cornered thing. He showed her the knife, then pointed to the wound. "This is going to hurt," he said, more to himself than to her. "But it has to be done." He held her down with one hand, his grip firm but not crushing, and with the other he made the swift, deep cut. She cried out, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through him like a shard of glass, and her body went rigid. Gritting his teeth, he probed for the arrowhead, his fingers slick with her blood. He found it locked against the bone, and with a final, brutal pull it came free. She went limp beneath his hand, unconscious once more. For the next few hours he was lost in the rhythm of care. He cleaned and stitched the wound, his movements slow and deliberate. He brewed herbs into a poultice, the kind his own mother had used, and packed it against the fevered skin. He bathed her face, washing away the grime and the tears, and saw for the first time the delicate beauty beneath the pain. She was young, her features fine and proud even in their slackness. He pulled a chair to the side of the cot and sat, the colt on his lap, watching her breathe. The storm in his own soul was quiet for once, replaced by a fierce, unfamiliar sense of purpose. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a guardian, a protector. He had invited the wolf to his door, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the pack would not be far behind. But as he looked at the sleeping girl, he knew he could not turn them away. He had spent years building walls around his heart, and in a single act of mercy, a dying girl had torn them all down. He had found her in the dust, but in saving her, he was beginning to suspect he might just be saving himself. He must have drifted off, lulled by the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the soft, steady breathing from the cot. The sun was just a pale promise on the eastern horizon when a sound, not a sound but a feeling, a deep, resonant vibration in the very earth beneath the cabin, pulled him from his shallow slumber. He was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding a frantic drum against his ribs, the colt leaping into his hand as if it were an extension of his own arm. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the rough-hewn shutters, and his blood ran cold. The world outside had been transformed. Where last night there had been only empty plains and silent hills, there was now a sea of men and horses. They were a silent, menacing army, their forms stark against the gray dawn. APACHEs, not a scouting party, not a handful of trackers. It was a war party, at least 300 strong, forming a perfect, suffocating circle around his small patch of land. They sat on their ponies, motionless and patient, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the cabin. Lances tipped with eagle feathers pointed to the sky, and the morning light glinted off the barrels of rifles held loosely in their arms. There was no war cry, No sound at all save for the nervous snorting of their horses and the ever-present whisper of the wind. The silence was more terrifying than any scream. It was the silence of judgment, the quiet deliberation of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. Jedediah felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead. He had known they would come, but he had not anticipated this. This was not a search party for a lost girl. This was an army on the verge of annihilation. He was one man with one pistol and a rifle against a force that could wipe his existence from the face of the earth without a second thought. He glanced back at the girl on the cot. She was still sleeping, her face serene, oblivious to the deadly ring of steel and fury that had closed around them. A bitter irony washed over him. He had spent a decade facing down death in all its forms, and now it had come for him not because of a card game or a bounty, but because of a single moment of compassion. The man they called the Stoic Protector had finally found something to protect, and in doing so had likely signed his own death warrant. He moved to the door, his mind racing. He could try to fight. It would be a short, bloody affair, his final stand a footnote in the brutal history of the West. Or he could try to talk. But what could he say? How could he, a white man, a natural enemy, explain that the girl they sought was safe inside, that he had tended to her wounds, that he meant her no harm? They would see only a kidnapper, a defiler. They would see his white skin and assume the worst, and their vengeance would be swift and terrible. From the center of the line, one warrior dismounted and began to walk slowly toward the cabin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of granite and grief. He wore the eagle-feather headdress of a chief, and he moved with an authority that left no doubt as to his command. This was the leader, the father Jedediah guessed, or perhaps a brother. This was the man whose heart he had either mended or broken. As the chief drew closer, Jedediah could see the cold fire in his eyes. It was a look he knew well, the look of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left but rage. Jedediah took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and imminent doom. He knew he had only one choice. To hide would be an admission of guilt. To fight would be suicide. He had to face them. He had to walk out that door and meet the storm head-on. He slid the bar from the door, the heavy wood groaning in protest. He took one last look at the sleeping girl, a silent prayer on his lips, and then he stepped out into the cold morning light, into the heart of the Apache Nation, and stood alone to face his judgment. The moment Jedediah stepped onto the porch, a low murmur rippled through the assembled warriors. The air grew thick, heavy with a tension that was almost suffocating. He stood tall, his hand not on his gun but held open at his side, a universal sign of peace he hoped they would recognize. He did not let his gaze wander over the sea of faces. He kept it fixed on the approaching chief. The man was a giant, his presence casting a long shadow in the dawn light. He stopped 20 paces from the porch, his eyes, black and piercing, boring into Jedediah's, searching for weakness, for deceit, for any reason to give the order that would end his life. The chief's face was a roadmap of hardship and war, but etched most deeply was the raw, open wound of a father's fear. "Where is she?" The chief's voice was low, a gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The words were English, clipped and precise, surprising Jedediah. "She is inside," Jedediah replied, his own voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil in his gut. "She is safe." The chief's eyes narrowed. "You lie. The white man knows only how to take. You stole her." "I found her," Jedediah said, his tone earnest, direct. "In the dust, half dead. She had been shot." He gestured with his chin toward the distant plains. "Out there, alone." A flicker of something, perhaps uncertainty, crossed the chief's face, but it was quickly replaced by the hard mask of command. He did not want to believe. It was easier to hate, easier to seek vengeance. "My daughter Morning Star is a great warrior," the chief said, his voice ringing with a pride that was laced with pain. "She would not be found in the dust." "An arrow," Jedediah clarified, "in her back. The shaft was broken. She was fleeing." He held the chief's gaze, refusing to look away. I am a man who has seen much death. She was close to it. I brought her here. I took the arrowhead out. I cleaned the wound. She is weak, but she lives. From behind the chief, a younger warrior, his face a canvas of hot-headed fury, spurred his horse forward. He lies, father. He is a white man. Let us burn this place and take back what is ours. The chief did not even turn his head. He raised a single hand, and the young warrior fell silent. His face still contorted with rage, but obedient. The chief, whose name was Cochise, a name whispered in fear by settlers and soldiers alike, turned his attention back to Jedediah. He was a man torn between the rage of his warriors and the desperate, flickering hope that this lone man might be telling the truth. "Show me," Cochise commanded. "Bring her out." "She cannot be moved," Jedediah said firmly. "The wound is deep. She has a fever. To move her now might kill her." He knew this was the most dangerous moment. To refuse the chief's demand was an act of defiance that could be his last. "You ask me to trust the word of a man who lives on stolen land, who carries the guns that have killed my people?" Cochise's voice was dangerously quiet. "I ask you to be a father who wants his daughter to live," Jedediah countered, his words cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "I give you my word. No harm has come to her here. No harm will. Let her rest. Let her heal. I have nothing to gain from this but your trust." The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. The warriors watched their chief, their hands tight on their weapons, waiting for the signal. Jedediah could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on him, each one a silent accuser. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a faint sound came from inside the cabin. A woman's voice, weak but clear, speaking in the Apache tongue. Cochise's head snapped toward the cabin door, his stoic facade crumbling for a fraction of a second, replaced by raw, naked hope. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. Jedediah did not move. He simply stood aside, giving the chief a clear path to the door. Cochise paused at the threshold, his great frame filling the doorway. He looked back at Jedediah, his eyes now filled with a complex mixture of suspicion, grudging respect, and a father's desperate love. Then he disappeared inside. The world held its breath. Jedediah remained on the porch, a lone statue in a theater of suspended violence. The Apache warriors waited, a silent, coiled spring of deadly potential. Every rustle of the wind, every stamp of a horse's hoof, sounded like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. He could not hear what was being said inside the cabin, only the low, guttural murmur of the Apache language, a sound of comfort and of pain. It felt like an eternity, but it could only have been a few minutes before Cochise reemerged. His face was unreadable, the stone mask of the chief back in place, but Jedediah saw something different in his eyes. The fire of pure rage had been banked, replaced by the heavy embers of a difficult decision. The great chief stood on the porch, looking not at Jedediah, but out at his own people. "She lives," he announced, his voice carrying across the plains. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the warriors, a barely audible release of tension. "The white man speaks the truth." He removed the arrow. "She is weak, but her spirit is strong." He then turned his gaze back to Jedediah, and it was hard and calculating. "My daughter tells me you were gentle, that you gave her water and tended her wound without dishonor." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "For this you have earned my gratitude, and for this you will live." Jedediah gave a slow, deliberate nod. He had not realized he had been holding his breath until he felt his lungs burn for air. But the ordeal was not over. Cochise walked down the steps and stood before him, so close that Jedediah could see the intricate beadwork on his chest plate. "But she cannot be moved. The journey back to our camp would steal the life this man has fought to save." He looked Jedediah up and down, his gaze lingering on the worn holster and the calloused hands. "You are a warrior. I can see it. You live alone, but you are not a peaceful man." "I am now," Jedediah said quietly. "Or I'm trying to be." Cochise grunted, a sound of cynical disbelief. Peace is not a cloak you can put on. It is a path you must walk. We will see which path you are on. He turned and issued a series of sharp commands to his warriors. The vast majority of the men began to turn their horses, their movements fluid and disciplined. They flowed back toward the hills from which they came, a receding tide of silent power. But 20 of them did not leave. They dismounted, their faces hard and uncompromising, and fanned out to form a new, wider perimeter around the cabin. They were not leaving him alone. They were not trusting him completely. My daughter will remain here until she is strong enough to ride, Cochise stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. My men will remain to watch over her, and to watch over you. He gestured to the young, hot-headed warrior who had spoken out earlier. My son, Taz, will lead them. He does not share my patience. Do not give him a reason to question my judgment. It was not an alliance. It was a hostage situation, and he was as much a prisoner as a guardian. He was trapped between his patient, a recovering Apache girl, and her fiercely protective, deeply suspicious family. You will be provided for, Cochise continued. Food will be left for you, but you will not leave this land. You will not ride for the white man's town. You will stay here, under the eyes of my warriors, until I return for my daughter. With that, the great chief mounted his horse. He gave Jedediah one last, long, searching look. Morning Star says your spirit is wounded, like hers. She says you carry a great sadness. Perhaps the Great Spirit has brought you together for a reason. He then turned and rode away, his form shrinking against the vastness of the plains, leaving Jedediah in a world that had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer a solitary man in an empty wilderness. He was now the reluctant host to an Apache princess, the warden of his own home, and the subject of scrutiny for 20 warriors who would as soon kill him as look at him. The slow-burn fuse of his new life had just been lit. The days that followed were a study in quiet tension. The 20 Apache warriors were a constant, silent presence, their dark eyes following Jedediah's every move. They were ghosts at the edge of his vision, shadows that shifted among the rocks and junipers. He was a prisoner on his own land, the invisible walls of their surveillance more confining than any iron bars. Yet, within the cabin, a fragile peace began to bloom. The girl, Morning Star, slowly regained her strength. The fever broke, and the color began to return to her cheeks. She would sit propped up on the cot, her hands busy mending her torn dress with a needle and thread Jedediah had given her. They existed in a world of shared silence, their communication a tapestry woven from gestures and glances. He would cook for her, simple meals of rabbit stew and cornbread, and she would accept them with a quiet nod of gratitude. Her presence softened the hard edges of the cabin, and of him. He found himself speaking to her, telling her stories of his childhood, of the farm he had left behind, not knowing if she understood the words but needing to fill the silence with something other than the ghosts of his past. One evening, as he sat cleaning his rifle, she spoke for the first time in his language. Why? Her voice was soft, like the rustle of dry leaves, but it cut through the quiet of the room. He stopped his work, looking at her in surprise. Why what? Why you help me? She asked, her dark eyes searching his face. He considered the question for a long time. He could have given her a simple answer, but she deserved more. Because, he began, his voice raspy with emotion, I have spent too much of my life taking, hurting. I saw you and I wanted to build something for once, not tear it down. A flicker of understanding crossed her features. She looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from both labor and violence. You are like him, she whispered. Jedediah frowned. Like who? Fear, cold and sharp, entered her eyes for the first time since the fever had left her. The man I was running from. He is also a white man, but his spirit is not wounded. It is empty, cold, like a snake in winter. It was then that the true story began to unravel. Morning Star, with her halting English, painted a picture of a man named Silas Thorne, a wealthy rancher whose land bordered the Apache territory. Thorn was a man of insatiable greed, a possessive tyrant who saw the land not as a mother to be respected, but as a thing to be conquered and owned. He had been trying for years to force her people off their ancestral hunting grounds, using his money and influence to poison the local soldiers against them. But it was not just the land he wanted. He had seen Morning Star during a tense parley and had become obsessed with her. He did not see her beauty or her spirit. He saw a prize, an exotic jewel to be added to his collection. "He say he would have me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "He say he would own me. My father, the great Cochise, told him an Apache woman is not a horse to be traded, that she chooses her own path." This refusal had enraged Thorn. He had tried to abduct her, sending his hired men to ambush her while she was hunting. That was how she had been shot. The arrow was not from an enemy tribe. It was one of her own, fired by one of her kinsmen who had been killed in the fight. She had managed to escape, riding her horse until it collapsed, and then running until she could run no more, finally falling into the dust where Jedediah had found her. Jedediah felt a cold fury build within him, a righteous anger he had not felt in years. This was not a simple misunderstanding between settlers and natives. This was the work of a monster, a man who treated people like property. He looked at Morning Star, at her resilience and her quiet strength, and he understood the depth of Thorn's depravity. The antagonist was no longer a faceless symbol of greed. He had a name, Silas Thorn, and Jedediah knew, with the chilling certainty of a prophet, that Thorn would not give up. He would come looking for his property. The circle of Apache warriors outside was not just there to watch him. They were a buffer against a coming storm. But Jedediah suspected that when Thorn arrived, with his wealth and his hired guns, 20 warriors would not be enough. The redemption he had sought in quiet isolation was not to be. His redemption would be found in the crucible of conflict, standing beside this woman against the darkness that pursued her. The arrival of Silas Thorn was not subtle. He did not come like a thief in the night, but with the arrogant fanfare of a conquering king. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced his approach long before the sound of his party reached the cabin. Jedediah stood on the porch, Morning Star at his side, her hand resting on his arm, no longer as a patient seeking support, but as a partner facing a common enemy. The 20 Apache warriors, led by the fiery Taz, had melted into the landscape, their positions concealed but their presence a palpable threat. Thorn rode a magnificent black stallion, his saddle trimmed with silver. He was a man in his prime, dressed in expensive tailored clothes that seemed out of place in the rugged wilderness. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, his thin lips permanently set in a sneer of entitlement. Behind him rode a dozen men, hard-faced mercenaries with rifles held ready across their saddles. They were not cowboys. They were killers for hire, their eyes cold and empty. Thorn reined in his horse just beyond the invisible perimeter set by the Apaches, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin with contempt. When his eyes landed on Morning Star, a possessive, triumphant smile spread across his face. "There you are, my dear," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, yet dripping with venom. "I was so worried. It seems you've found yourself some rather rustic accommodations." Morning Star's grip on Jedediah's arm tightened. "Do not speak to me, snake," she spat, her voice ringing with defiance. Thorn's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. He finally turned his attention to Jedediah, looking him up and down as if he were a piece of dirt. "And who might this be? The local welcoming committee? I'm the man telling you to turn your horse around and ride away," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. Thorn laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You have spirit, I'll grant you that, but you are clearly out of your depth. That girl is my property. I have a claim on her. She is a free woman," Jedediah stated, his feet planted firmly. "She belongs to no one. She belongs to me." Thorn roared, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the tyrant beneath. "I paid a good price for her. Morning Star looked at Jedediah, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. What does he mean? He's lying, Jedediah said, his gaze locked with Thorn's. He's a man who believes his money can buy anything, even a person's soul. From the rocks, Taz and his warriors rose as one, their bows drawn, their rifles aimed. The sudden appearance of the Apaches startled Thorn's men, their horses shifting nervously. Thorn himself seemed unfazed, even amused. "Ah, the welcoming party has arrived," he sneered. "A handful of savages with bows and arrows. I am not impressed. I have a dozen rifles here that say my claim is stronger." It was a standoff. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Thorn's arrogance was his armor, his belief in his own superiority so absolute that he could not see the danger he was in. He saw only a lone homesteader and a few natives, not the quiet resolve of a legendary gunslinger and the fierce loyalty of Apache warriors defending one of their own. "You are on Apache land," Tez called out, his voice sharp and clear. "You are not welcome here. Leave now, or your blood will water this thirsty ground." Thorn chuckled again. "This will be Apache land for only a little while longer. Progress is coming to this valley, gentlemen, and I am its herald. Now, give me the girl, and I might consider letting the rest of you live." "That's not going to happen," Jedediah said, his hand drifting down, his fingers brushing the handle of his Colt. The movement was slow, deliberate, a signal that the time for talk was over. He was no longer just a protector, he was a champion. He was standing not just for Morning Star, but against every bully, every tyrant who believed their power gave them the right to own another human being. He was standing for the quiet honor he thought he had lost forever. The two sides faced each other under the harsh afternoon sun, two worlds colliding. On one side stood greed, entitlement, and brute force. On the other stood a wounded gunslinger, a resilient survivor, and a band of warriors, a found family forged in the fires of adversity, ready to make their stand. The world seemed to hold its breath. The silence was absolute, broken only by the nervous shuffle of horses and the low whistle of the wind. Silas Thorn's sneer tightened, his arrogance warring with the sudden, cold realization that this was not going to be as simple as he had imagined. The man before him, this quiet homesteader, possessed a stillness, a lethal calm that spoke of countless life-or-death confrontations. And the Apaches in the rocks were not wavering. Their arrows were aimed, their focus absolute. "Last chance," Thorn hissed, his hand moving toward the expensive, silver-inlaid pistol on his hip. "Give me the girl." "No." Jedediah's voice was flat, final. That single word was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Thorn drew his pistol, but he was a wealthy man playing at being a gunslinger. Jedediah was the real thing. The Colt seemed to leap into his hand, an extension of his will. The first shot was a deafening crack that sent a flock of birds scattering into the sky. Thorn's pistol clattered to the ground, his hand erupting in a spray of red as Jedediah's bullet shattered his wrist. Thorn screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and pain that was utterly unbecoming of the tyrant he pretended to be. That single shot was the signal. Arrows whispered through the air, silent and deadly. Two of Thorn's mercenaries tumbled from their saddles, arrows protruding from their chests, their rifles discharging harmlessly into the sky. The remaining hired guns, professionals to the last, recovered instantly from their surprise. They spurred their horses, fanning out and returning fire, their bullets splintering the wood of the cabin porch and kicking up dust around Jedediah's feet. Jedediah pushed Morning Star back toward the relative safety of the doorway. "Stay down," he yelled, firing again, his second shot taking another of Thorn's men in the shoulder, sending him spinning from his horse. He was a whirlwind of deadly efficiency, his movements economical, precise. The years of violence he had tried to suppress came rushing back. But this time it was different. It was not for money or survival. It was for her. It was for honor. Morning Star, however, was not a damsel to be sheltered. She disappeared into the cabin for a moment, then reemerged with Jedediah's rifle. She did not hesitate. Bracing the stock against her good shoulder, She took aim and fired. One of the mercenaries, who was drawing a bead on an exposed Apache warrior, suddenly jerked and fell, a clean shot through his center mass. Her face was a mask of grim determination. The resilient survivor turned hero. From the rocks, Taz and his warriors provided a deadly covering fire. They were masters of their environment, moving like phantoms, their arrows finding their marks with chilling accuracy. Thorne's men were disoriented, caught between the deadly precision of the gunslinger on the porch and the guerrilla tactics of the Apaches in the hills. They were fighting a battle on two fronts, against an enemy who was both in front of them and all around them. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Within minutes, half of Thorne's men were dead or wounded. The rest, seeing the futility of their position, lost their nerve. They turned and fled, spurring their horses in a mad panic back toward the civilized world, leaving their employer screaming in the dust. Silas Thorne clutched his ruined hand, his face pale with shock and disbelief. His power, his money, his influence, it had all meant nothing in the face of true courage. He looked up at Jedediah, who now stood over him, the barrel of his Colt smoking in the afternoon light. "This isn't over," Thorne gasped, his voice a pathetic whimper. "I'll have the cavalry on you. I'll see you hanged." Jedediah looked down at him, his face devoid of pity. "You'll do nothing," he said, his voice cold as stone. "You'll ride out of this valley and you will never return. You will forget you ever saw this place, and you will forget you ever saw her. If I ever hear your name again, I will find you. And next time, I won't aim for your hand." He then turned his back on the groveling man, a gesture of ultimate contempt. Taz and two of his warriors emerged from the rocks. They hauled Thorne to his feet, threw him unceremoniously onto one of the remaining horses, and sent it galloping away with a sharp slap to its rump. The threat was vanquished. The dust began to settle, leaving behind the quiet aftermath of violence. Jedediah stood on his porch, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air, and looked at Morning Star. She met his gaze, the rifle still held in her hands, her eyes shining with pride and gratitude. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, a bond forged in shared peril and mutual respect. The stoic protector had found his cause, and the resilient survivor had found her strength. Together, they had faced the storm and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. The silence that descended after the firefight was deeper than any that had come before. It was a silence of completion, of a chapter closed. The bodies of the fallen mercenaries were a grim testament to the battle, but they were soon removed by Taz and his men, their presence erased from the land as if they had never been. The harsh frontier had a way of cleaning its own wounds. A few days later, as the sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. It was Cochise, returning as he had promised, this time with a smaller, more peaceful escort. He rode with the same quiet dignity, but the grief and suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by a look of profound respect. He dismounted before the cabin where Jedediah and Morning Star stood waiting. He did not look at his daughter first. He looked at Jedediah. "My son has told me what happened here," Cochise said, his voice resonating with gratitude. "He told me how you stood against the snake, Thorne. He told me how you fought not as a man protecting his property, but as a warrior protecting his family." He placed a hand over his heart. "For what you have done for my daughter, and for the honor you have shown, the Apache people will forever call you friend. My home is your home. My people are your people." It was the highest honor a man like Cochise could bestow, a bridge built between two worlds that had so often been at war. Jedediah simply nodded, his heart too full for words. He had sought redemption in isolation, but he had found it in connection, in the shared bond of a found family. Cochise then turned to Morning Star, his face softening with a father's love. "It is time to come home, my daughter. You are healed. Your place is with your people." Morning Star looked at her father, and then she looked at Jedediah. Her heart was torn. She was a daughter of the Apache. Her roots ran deep in the traditions and the lands of her people. But she was also a woman who had found something unexpected in this quiet cabin, with this quiet, wounded man. She had found a partner, a man who saw her not as a prize, but as an equal. She walked to Jedediah's side and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "Father," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My place is here." Cochise looked at their joined hands, and a slow, wise smile spread across his face. He was a chief, but he was also a father who knew the language of the heart. He saw the bond between them, a love as strong and resilient as the mountains themselves. "The path of the heart is the path of the Great Spirit," he said, his voice filled with a surprising tenderness. "A woman's strength is not in her obedience, but in the courage to choose her own trail. It seems you have found yours." He gave his blessing with a nod. He would not stand in the way of her happiness. He knew his daughter was not leaving her people, but rather, she was expanding their circle, creating a new kind of family in this wild, unpredictable land. As Cochise and his men departed, a sense of profound peace settled over the cabin. The external threat was gone, the conflict resolved. All that remained was the quiet, powerful love that had grown between a solitary gunslinger and a brave Apache woman. They stood together on the porch, watching the last of the sunlight fade, their hands still intertwined. The wind still whispered through the plains, but it no longer sounded like a lament of loneliness. It sounded like a promise, a song of a new beginning. The redemption arc was complete, not with a final, glorious battle, but with the quiet, powerful choice to love and to build a life together. And so they began to build. Their life was a quiet poem written on the canvas of the frontier. Jedediah's cabin, once a fortress against the world, became a home, filled with the warmth of a shared life. The walls that had once echoed with silence now held the soft murmur of two languages blending into one, a language of love and respect that was uniquely theirs. Morning Star did not abandon her heritage. She brought it with her, weaving it into the fabric of their daily existence. She taught Jedediah the names of the stars in her tongue and the ancient stories of her people. She showed him which plants held medicine and which roots gave sustenance. Her spirit, vibrant and deeply connected to the earth, brought a life to the homestead that it had never known. In turn, Jedediah shared his world with her. He taught her to read and write English, sitting by the fire in the long evenings, their heads bent together over a well-worn book. He showed her the quiet satisfaction of tending a garden, of coaxing life from the stubborn soil. He was no longer the stoic protector, but a gentle partner, his gruff exterior melted away by the steady warmth of her love. He put his gun away, hanging the Colt on a peg on the wall, not as a trophy, but as a relic of a life left behind. He had found a new purpose, a new kind of strength that did not come from the speed of his draw, but from the steadfastness of his heart. Their ranch became a bridge between two worlds. Taz and his warriors were frequent visitors, not as guards, but as friends, as family. They would share meals, trade stories, and work alongside Jedediah in the fields. The settlers in the distant town, hearing the story of how Jedediah had driven off the tyrant Thorn, began to look at him with a new respect. They saw not just a reclusive homesteader, but a man of honor, a man who had forged an unlikely peace. Their love story became a quiet legend, a testament to the idea that hope could flourish in the most unlikely of places. They faced hardships, of course. The land was unforgiving, the winters harsh, the work endless. But they faced it all together, their bond a shield against any storm. They were two broken souls who had found their other half, two survivors who had created their own sanctuary. Their happily ever after was not one of grand romance and flowery words. It was something deeper, more real. It was in the shared silence of a sunrise, the comfort of a hand held in the dark, the quiet joy of building a life, day by day, side by side. It was a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to heal, to love, and to find its home. And what of the love that finds us when we least expect it? What of the courage it takes to open a door to a stranger, to offer a hand to someone in need? The story of Jedediah and Morning Star is more than just a tale of the Old West. It is a story about the walls we build around our hearts and the brave souls who dare to tear them down. It is a reminder that our greatest strength is often found not in our solitude, but in the families we choose. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If their story has touched your heart, we invite you to comment below with your thoughts, to like this video, and to subscribe for more tales of inspirational love and redemption.